I had someone a while back ask if I could spend some time talking about how to record a Screamo record, and I'm not really an expert on recording. I thought that I would spend some time talking about what's a good way that you can sort of like cheaply make a demo. How can you sort of like maximize your bang for your buck when you're recording at home and you don't have a ton of time, but you want to make something that sounds at least okay, at least where you can hear everything in the record and it's just not super muddy. So I'm going to go through some basic tips and tricks and some introductory info about how you can get started with at-home recording. And I'm also going to spend some time going over what the most necessary gear is, some of the things you probably absolutely have to own if you want to try your hand at doing this. So to begin with, we're going to talk about microphones. You probably don't even need, a particularly nice microphone depending upon what kind of music you're trying to make. If you're doing your at-home basement Screamo demo, you might even be able to get away with just using, I don't know, the onboard mic on some recording device to do pretty much everything. But if you want to get a little bit fancier, you might want to pick up a couple mics. There are two types of microphone which are probably the most common, and we'll talk about those because I feel it's unlikely that you would buy any other kind of microphone. And those are dynamic and condenser microphones. There are slight differences between them. The two microphones behind me are both dynamic microphones, and I'll pick up the microphone that I'm using to record this in a second because it's the only condenser microphone that I have in the house at the time. The basic difference between a dynamic mic and a condenser microphone is that a dynamic microphone functions sort of like the reverse of a speaker. You talk into it or you produce sound into it, and this vibrates a coil or a speaker-like surface, which then affects a magnet, and that is turned into an electrical signal that is sent to whatever recording device you're using. This is like a pretty durable and reliable way of capturing sound, but there are some limitations. It doesn't typically capture as much of the EQ range, or you could say the natural tone of what you're trying to record. For that reason, people typically use them for live applications or situations where you're recording something that's really, really loud. So if you're recording live too, you might want to use these. And we've got the Audio Technica Pro 63 here. This was designed mostly for recording live instruments like a guitar amp or something like that, particularly in a room where other stuff is being played. And then we've got this is the Audio Technica Pro 31. This is mostly for vocal applications. You could sort of think of both of these mics as comparable to the SM58 and the SM57 in the Shure line too. They're a little bit cheaper, but they're of a fairly similar quality. Yeah, I don't think you're going to get the best recording quality out of using stuff like this, but they're very reliable. I'm going to have to cut the sound probably for a second to pick up and show you the condenser that I'm currently using. Condensers function by having a diaphragm that moves away and toward a charged magnet, or rather there's a current, I believe, moving between the two of them, and that difference in electrical potential that occurs as the distance between them increases and decreases is transferred into some kind of signal, which is then recorded. So there are some advantages to using condensers, the biggest one probably being that you're going to capture more EQ range, more of the natural sound. They don't handle heavy sound input, like loud sounds, nearly as well. They get distorted much more easily. They can be damaged more easily. You also need phantom power, or like voltage passing through the microphone for it to work. So certain recording applications, you might not be able to use them because you just don't have phantom power, because certain recording devices just don't come with phantom power. So that's something to keep in mind. They're really great for recording vocals. They're really great for recording drums, and typically an overhead application where you can also use them to directly close mic drums themselves. They're a more variable microphone. They can do more things, I think, than most dynamic microphones. Condenser microphones can have broader ranges. So this one is cardioid. These two are cardioid. Cardioid means that they basically are directional microphones and they capture sound in a particular direction, but you can have more omnidirectional or even more concentrated sound capturing fields as well. For home recording, you probably aren't going to want something that's more omnidirectional. You probably will want 1 to 3 condenser microphones and 1 to 3 dynamic microphones for most applications. In terms of what to track with, you have basically two options in this day and age, and the first one is your classic 4, 8, or maybe even 16 track recorder. I have one right here. This is the TASCAM DP006. I've had this for years. It's a little field recorder. It has the inputs for 2 microphones, and it has 2 onboard microphones in the front as well. I believe that means you can record up to 4 tracks simultaneously. I haven't used this thing in a really long time, so I'm actually not entirely certain. I think it might just be 2, but you can have one of those tracks be stereo. It's been a while. These are great because they're so cheap. They're very portable. They're also fairly easy to use. You know, memory cards I think are cheaper than external hard drives. There's a lot of disadvantages too. You know, you don't get as much power over editing. You can edit tracks, but it's not very easy. Punching in is not really going to be a serious option. So, you know, whatever you record on the first pass is probably what you're going to get. It's good in a way because it trains you to get good at what you're playing, and you want to make sure that the take is good. It's fantastic for recording live for that reason too, if the band is really tight. But yeah, there's obvious limitations, and you're also not going to be able to make anything sort of that complex unless you sort of record the 4 tracks that you have and then mix some of those tracks down to a single track so that you can record further tracks. And that can be a really complicated process, and you have to be very satisfied with what you record the first time for that same reason. Another thing to keep in mind about a lot of 4, 8, 16 track recorders is that they can introduce a lot of noise, whether they be digital or tape-based. I've noticed that there's quite a lot of hiss usually in the stems that they produce, or I guess in a digital sense it's more like bit crushing. The overall recording quality is going to be fairly lo-fi with these things, but you know, at the end of the day, if you're not trying to spend a whole lot of money on a really fancy computer or whatnot, and you're just trying to record something now, there's really no better option for a low-budget entry recording. The other option is to have a computer interface and a DAW, and I think I'm just going to show you really quickly what I'm using to record this, because I'm recording this with a computer interface and a DAW. So here we have the setup for this, right? I have my MacBook, and this is a Focusrite 4i4. It has 4 inputs. So while some interfaces are cheaper, overall, you know, you're going to be spending more money for this because you're going to have a computer too. Some DAWs are free. You know, Audacity costs no money whatsoever, but it has pretty limited features. Definitely more costly, but you're going to get a much better quality of sound recording. Most interfaces have phantom power, which makes recording a lot easier with condensers. As they get more expensive, you get more inputs too, which can make, you know, the overall quality of recording better, because as a general rule of thumb, you know, the more microphones you can record something with, the better it's going to sound in the long run, because you have more to play with when you actually get to the mixing stage. There's a couple more pieces of gear that I wanted to talk about for recording as well that are probably fairly necessary. One would be a mic stand. I probably want boom mic stands, not straight mic stands, maybe at least 2, probably more like 3 or 4 would really help your at-home recording setup be fully complete. Another thing you might benefit from owning is a pop filter. Pop filters are for recording with microphones, particularly condensers. They serve a few purposes. One of which is to keep the distance at which you are speaking into the microphone more regulated, so that you don't worry about as much variation in the volume and how much echo there is in the background, how much natural reverberation there is in the sound. Another thing that can happen, you know, when you get too close to the microphone or too loud, is that you produce these things, these distortions through plosives in particular, and this can reduce that popping sound that you would get. So you're going to get a much higher quality of recording if you use one of these. It will also help save your condensers, because moisture and loud noises can damage condensers in the long run. Another thing you might want to get is a DI box, particularly if you are recording live, because this allows you to take a signal and send one split of that signal to an amplifier so that you can hear yourself live in the room without monitoring, and send another signal directly into a recording interface or a recording device. So that way you get your pure, clean tone directly from the instrument, and you also get to have monitoring in the room that sounds normal for how you would play if you're recording live. So in terms of where to record, you want to find a room that doesn't have a ton of natural reverberation, unless that's part of the sound that you're going for, but you can always, you know, add more reverb artificially after the fact. It might not sound quite as good as the excellent natural reverb you might get in certain situations. I think it's always better to start with a drier input and then try and make things more wet in the course of mixing. Whatever your drum setup is, you probably want to make sure that you're muting your drums to some extent, especially the heads. T-shirts work great. You can also use moon gels or sticky hands if you don't have any moon gel. A lot of the natural resonance that really helps with live performance and making drums really punch through kind of has the opposite effect with recording. It can make the attack sound less present, and you really want things, I think, to be very attack heavy and thumpy, particularly when you're recording punk and screamo and hardcore. If you're recording live with the whole band playing together, you probably want to make sure that any amps you're recording with are turned away from the drum kit. And if you have a barrier that you can place between the amps and the kit, that's even better. Ideally, in terms of reducing bleed, you just single track everything, and I think at home recording, you can produce a much better sounding record, depending upon the conditions. Sometimes that's not an option, sometimes it's just not the vibe for the record. You definitely, I think, want to record the vocals separately in most situations. It will help you have more flexibility with how the vocals sound in the long run, and a lot of vocalists, I think, have a hard time doing a live performance with a band that's going to be as quality as they can do when they're controlling it themselves on their own. Obviously, bleed is also a huge issue with recording live vocals. Go back to drums for a second. You probably want at least 2 microphones on your drum kit, 2 overheads, which are going to be placed equidistant from the center of the snare drum, and you can measure that with just a piece of string going to each of them. If you're going to add microphones from there, I would probably first add a kick drum mic, and then after that, if I'm adding a 4th microphone, I would add a snare drum, and then move on to adding either a 2nd snare drum or maybe consider rack tom mics. 2 mics overhead is kind of the starting point of your classic at-home drum recording setup. You probably want both of those microphones to be condensers if possible. Regardless, you probably want them to be also like the same microphones, so it's a good idea to have 2 of at least 1 microphone that you own. In terms of capturing instruments, you probably want to DI things as frequently as possible because it will give you that pure signal that you can play with in the future. And if you really want to go back and get something that sounds more live, you can do this technique called reamping, which is basically where you take a DI signal and you send it back through an amplifier, and then you record that with microphones after the fact. And this will give you a lot more sound isolation. Even if the original signal was recorded in a live setting, you're not going to get any bleed whatsoever. You can really play with tone. You can use more inputs if your interface has a limited number of inputs that are just dedicated to one specific instrument. And also, you can just throw on amp simulators too. Like, this gives you way more flexibility in terms of dialing tone. The last thing I'm going to talk about is actually like making a physical copy of your record once you're finished, and you can do this at home too. There's a few things you're probably going to need. One being, a way to make copies of a record. You can get a tape deck which has record in order to make tapes of your record, and you can record directly from the DAW or bounce tracks to something else. Sometimes people also like to tape master something, which basically just means taking a record that you made, bouncing it to a tape, and then bouncing it back to digital format, so you have a sort of grittier, more blown out, condensed sound that comes with exporting something to tape. Sometimes the sort of subtractive effect of that is a really good effect. You also can get an external drive if you want to try and burn discs still with a computer. Some computers, especially older computers, are still going to have that capability. Otherwise, you're going to have to do CD duplication, which isn't really something that you can do on your own. Owning a printer is also really helpful, but you can, if you don't own a printer, you can go to the library. You're going to need to buy your own cardstock to make jackets or J-cards for either a CD or a tape, though. If you really don't even have a computer, you can just take a J-card or a CD case that you like already, trace around it onto a piece of paper, make your art within that, and then photocopy that onto a cardstock. Some of my first record covers I made using that method, kind of just like collaging stuff in. If you want to move on to designing on the computer, you can get graphic design programs for free, like Inkscape or GIMP, that will help you design stuff that you can then print out using a printer at home. In terms of jewel cases, you can try and make some of your own out of thinner cardboard. That can be pretty challenging. I typically recommend just ordering them. It's not really worth the labor of trying to put them together yourself. If you want to get jewel cases, I think the best place to source them from is duplication.ca, but there's a bunch of options too. That pretty much rounds out all the advice that I had for making your own record at home. I hope you have good luck with it and you enjoy the process, and just know that it's going to take a while, but you'll probably be very happy and gratified when you get to the end of it.